It's a pleasure to welcome you here in today's webinar. Given that you have logged in, I assume you agree with the basic premise of this project, namely that carbon pricing plays a pivotal role in our path toward global decarbonization. We have many countries that have imposed a carbon price. Many others are considering it, yet carbon pricing still only covers 20% of global emissions. So there's still a long way to go. And I think increasing this coverage, in addition to strengthening the instruments in place, is paramount. What's needed for this, however, is a very good view and take on potential and readiness for introducing carbon pricing, geographically, sectorally. And that's precisely what today's webinar is about. It's based on a project funded by the German Emissions Trading Authority, DEST, which is part of the German Environment Agency, UBA. Over the past 3 years in this project, led by my colleague, Dr. Barandoda, we've done an in-depth assessment of the potential of carbon pricing in South and East Asian countries. And we've done this in collaboration with experts from Duke University and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. For full details from start to finish on the project, please see the project's first 2 reports, which have already been published. You'll find the links in the chat. A final report that brings the whole project results together is still forthcoming. So here we are presenting to you the key insights from this project. First by the project team, Barandoda and my colleague Maya Hall will give you in a nutshell the 20 minutes. And then complemented by 2 expert perspectives from Alistair Ritchie from the Asia Society and Policy Institute and Benicio Yadi from ASEAN. So now let me get back to introducing Professor Daniel Klingenfeld. He is the head of Department Energy Installations, Aviation Registry and Economic Aspects at DEST. He also has a honorary professorship at Leuphana University in Lüneburg. And prior to that, a PhD from TU Berlin with a focus on carbon pricing. So is an expert and aficionado to the topic of our webinar at hand as well. Before joining DEST, Daniel Klingenfeld was the head of the director's staff at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Professor Klingenfeld, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And also from my side, a very warm welcome to all of you, wherever you may be joining us for this webinar. I would like to offer some thoughts by way of introduction. First, looking at the role that our institution, the German Emissions Trading Authority, is playing when it comes to international activities which are targeted to support the advancement of carbon pricing around the world. In fact, we have been charged for several years, for many years since the start of the European Union emissions trading system, with implementing that system in Germany. And since last year, we have also been implementing a new national emissions trading scheme for the heating and transport sectors. And in that capacity, we really aim to advance the progress of carbon pricing, and of course also to implement these schemes in our jurisdiction with a high degree of ecological and also economic integrity, but also not forgetting social aspects. Looking at the project we'll be discussing today, we really appreciate the progress and also the ongoing efforts to introduce carbon pricing instruments in Asia, and in particular also the very high potential to reduce emissions in many jurisdictions. And the case in point here I would like to mention are Indonesia and Vietnam, which are 2 countries also part of the case study we'll be hearing more about. And if we look ahead, if we see all this potential, of course, the way ahead is clearly to engage in bilateral and multilateral capacity building activities. We have been part as the German Environment Agency, and we are proudly taking part in that community, which is of course broader than us. It's really also made up of you who are joining us here today in this web seminar. And of course, the capacity building activities, they include activities in the field, of course, hands-on practice, also dialogue with stakeholders, but a strong grounding, that's at least how we see it, a strong grounding in research and very solid analysis. Our agency has been traditionally involved in such capacity building efforts with jurisdictions around the world, and also engaging with governmental agencies, research institutions, and also think tanks in order to share knowledge and experience, learn from each other with the ultimate objective to counter climate change, to think about and put forward economic instruments to reduce emissions in that perspective. And of course, as you know, there are very different levels of exchange on all levels. There are delegation workshops we have been involved with, in-house trainings, in-country visits, and that doesn't only include the public sector, but also private stakeholders. And I mentioned already an extensive research program is complementing these activities, and we're really very fond also to have been able to gain such well-known and research institutions who have led the project. Of course, Adelphi here as leader of the project, but also Chinese University of Hong Kong and other partners. We're very privileged to have you on board here. Looking at the topic of today's webinar and the focus of the project, I think it's without question that there is an ever-increasing need for strong global action to combat climate change. I guess if we look only in this year, I guess the writing is on the wall more clearly than ever. Looking at Asia, sadly, of course, we had to see and to record record droughts across large parts of China, as well as torrential rainfall for weeks without end in Pakistan, monsoon flooding in larger parts of India. So really, also in the region we're talking about today, you clearly see the climatic changes unfolding at high speed, and so the urgency to act is really here. And at the same time, and that's maybe a silver lining, recent years also show accelerated national efforts, also regional efforts, as well as internationally concerted efforts in the framework of the Paris Agreement with the aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And there, carbon pricing instruments such as ETS or tax systems are, in our view, and I hope that is shared, of course, among many of you, they are a key lever, a key policy instrument in the policy mix to drive decarbonization efforts in particularly also emissions-intensive sectors. And that combines with a high potential of emissions reductions in Asia that the study has also unveiled, combined with a so far in many places still high dependency on coal. And that, of course, has been the focus of the project, how to be able to address that. There have been efforts in Asia already that have been advancing pioneering systems, the Korean KETS, of course, you are aware of this one, and the Chinese national ETS system that was launched not long ago. So these systems are already in operation. They were not in the focus of the project, but we looked with the team actually at the several schemes currently in pre-implementation phase. And there are, of course, encouraging signs we'd like to know more and hear about more today. And that, in a sense, has also been our driver to commission the project, to better understand, to better learn, also to engage in a dialogue process, how to advance climate policy and carbon pricing all over the world. And I would like to also really here, with the context to the studies, also send a word of appreciation to our partners, ASPI and ASEAN Accept, which are really also important actors in research and capacity building in the region. We're really fond to have been able to work with you here. My last thoughts before closing are on the developments in Europe. Again, I'm sure you're aware of the Fit for 55 process that is currently now entering its final stage, so to say. The trilogue has begun. That's this trilateral discussion process between the European Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission. And the whole process is about charting a pathway and defining a policy mix that will enable the European Union to reduce its emission to at least 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. And that's, of course, is a very vast policy package and policy landscape. But an important point is really that carbon pricing has a central role in that journey. For Europe, and we will see an extension and an increase in ambition for the European Union emissions trading scheme, the operating one, but also a new extension that is at least under discussion to form a second European Union ETS, the ETS2, to include road transport and heating for buildings as of 2026. So again, carbon pricing is advancing across Europe, and I think that's also an important news if we really also have that perspective shared with Asia, where also these dynamic developments are taking place. A hot topic, so to say, is of course also the question of how to deal with free allocation, how to also deal with possibly also competition. So the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is slated to be introduced in 2026. Is of course a controversial topic, to be sure, but if designed well, and also if in a sense implemented well, and if communicated well, in my view, it could really also become a vehicle for advanced cooperation on climate change when it comes to carbon pricing, as the CBAM mechanism, of course, would only apply to jurisdictions which do not, in a sense, levy carbon prices on certain product classes. So in a sense, at least that's the hope, it could also be a driver of advanced or an enhanced climate protection around the globe. My last point here is the big question of social acceptability. That is really high on the agenda in Europe, and will also be high on the agenda in other parts of the world, in particular with a view to increasing carbon prices that will be necessary on our pathway towards net zero, ultimately, towards fully decarbonized sectors that are covered by ETS systems. So the social acceptability is a big question, not least also with the current situation of course, Russia's attack on Ukraine, that has also, of course, heightened the tension once again, with energy prices rising and these tensions, in a sense, coming on top. But there are answers. There are answers to it in terms of redistributing proceeds from cap and trade or tax systems. And we are also studying these at the German Emissions Trading Authority. And so also we'll be staying engaged in that discussion. But once again, this, in a sense, this view in 3 steps: economic integrity, environmental viability, but also social acceptability. These are the cornerstones of successful carbon pricing initiatives. Now I look forward to the presentations of that project, and once again, very warm welcome from our side. Over to you, Constanze.
Many thanks, Professor Klingenfeld. And we were lucky that your connection only got unstable in your very last sentence. So otherwise, thank you very much for the helpful framing and the positive words. We're close to 80 participants now, which is also a great sign of interest in this topic. Also a very varied and global audience, I would say, just judging from names that I see here on the participants list. But now let's get into the meat of this. Very happy to welcome Dr. Barandoda, who is heading Adelphi's carbon market and pricing team together with me, and who has been the lead of this project. He will give the presentation together with Maya Hall, who is a consultant in Adelphi's carbon pricing team and has played a key role in this project, driving progress throughout, and is also the lead author of the Indonesia case study. So over to you, Baran, for the best of insights in this project.
Thank you very much, Constance, and you've set a high bar, which I hope I will be able to meet. Welcome, everyone, and we are really glad to see you here in today's presentation of project insights from carbon pricing potential in Asia, opportunities and challenges. Before I hand over to my colleague Maya, I just wanted to mention a few things about this project. First of all, it's a big undertaking. It's already produced 2 very substantive reports, and a third one is on its way. Over the 3 years this project has been running, we've had many colleagues that have worked on it, as you will see from the author list in the various papers. And I would like to thank to all of them for their contributions. I also would like to thank the many people we have interviewed, especially in relation to the 3rd report that is about to come out. One person that we hoped would be here, Professor Anatol Bout, he is unfortunately sick and had to cancel in the last minute. We wish him well, and I'm really sad that he has missed the opportunity to see his work, our work, coming to completion here. He contributed a lot, so our thanks to him as well. And then I also would like to thank Maya, who I will give the floor to next to tell us about the first bits of the project. She well deserves this role because she has been involved with this project from the very beginning as well. So thank you, Maya, for jumping on board in the last second, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Baran. So I'll begin by giving a little bit of a an overview of what the project actually consisted of. So essentially it was split into 3 parts. The first, as you can see, was developing the theoretical framework largely based on a literature review. And then we applied this theoretical framework to 15 jurisdictions in East and South Asia, developing very detailed fact sheets, as you'll see in the reports that you can see in the link. And then the last step, as mentioned, was developing 3 case studies, in-depth deep dives of Indonesia, Vietnam, and Pakistan based on stakeholder mapping and interviews with various people in the different jurisdictions and internationally, and a final synthesis of the project findings. But we'll go into a bit more depth of each of these steps as we go along. Next slide, please. As mentioned, so the first report was published in May of last year, and the second one in June of this, if you could click the next, February of this year, and the next report is upcoming by the end of this year. So please keep your eyes open for that. So step 1 of the project consisted, as I mentioned, of developing this theoretical framework. So we basically did a very in-depth and structured literature review of over 500 publications of both academic and grey literature. In doing this, we identified key drivers and obstacles among 5 different dimensions. So these are political, legal, economic, technical, and regional dimensions. It's all very good having an analytical framework, but to be able to then turn theory into practice, we also identified several indicators and variables along these dimensions to grasp the relevant conditions for carbon pricing in jurisdictions in East and South Asia. Some of these some examples of these indicators and variables we can see on the next slide. So, for example, the economic dimension, we have the regulation of the power market, technical capacity, for example, monitoring, reporting, and verification. The multilateral dimension, we have the economic integration into the region. Legal, we have whether these jurisdictions have flagship climate laws and low carbon laws, kind of this policy framework that's conducive to carbon pricing. And political, one example was how influential the vested interests in fossil fuels are in that jurisdiction. And these you can find in the second report, in the first report, and then applied to the 15 jurisdictions in the second report. Next slide, please. So step 2 was then taking this analytical framework, this theoretical framework, and applying it to 15 pre-selected jurisdictions within the scope of the project. We were then able to use the set of indicators and variables and delve into each of these jurisdictions to reveal different pathways for carbon pricing, as well as the opportunities and challenges in each of these jurisdictions. The second part of the project was done using desk-based research only. The interviews came later on, and the report, as you can see here, is made up in large part by these detailed fact sheets of all the different jurisdictions, where this analysis has been compiled in a very structured way that can be compared as well. We then also clustered these 15 jurisdictions into groups based on the various common qualities that they had, but Baran will go into detail a little bit later about this. So these are the 15 jurisdictions that we looked into, quite varied, all in different stages of implementing or considering carbon pricing. Here we have an example of one of the fact sheets that was developed. I think this one is for Thailand. As you can see, the top part of this fact sheet consists of a table with key information that's relevant to the jurisdiction's carbon pricing landscape. So we have, for example, the capital, the government structure, GDP, population, things like this. And this is uniform across all the different fact sheets as well. Moving down the fact sheet, we then have a section on the carbon pricing readiness and options summary with some of the major obstacles and opportunities and findings for the particular jurisdiction. So this gives a very brief summary of the various points regarding carbon pricing of that jurisdiction. And then the rest of the fact sheet goes into a bit more of a deeper analysis per dimension, as I mentioned, so the political, legal, technical, economic, and multilateral. So you can find out more later on in the fact sheet as well. I'll now pass back to my colleague Baran, who can lead us through some of the key findings and the next steps of this project. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Maya, and that was a very good introduction to work that we undertook in the first 2 years of the project, more or less. Of course, this wasn't intended to be so long, but COVID pandemic made things quite a bit difficult, and here we are going into the analysis of the findings in the beginning of 2022. So what are some of the high-level findings from the analysis that was conducted under Work Package 2, where we have applied our analytical framework along these 5 dimensions, and you will hear a lot more about these in a second, to the different jurisdictions and what we found. Along the political dimension, we found that the interests that are entangled with fossil fuels are very diverse. This could be the producers of fossil fuels. This could be the users of the fossil fuels. It could be the power sector, which can be heavily reliant on fossil fuels, or it could be different ministries within the government that have interests that either go with or against the use of fossil fuels. One thing that we found is that where there is reliance on government and experts' revenues in a jurisdiction to fossil fuels, where they constitute a significant part of GDP, there is a strong economic rationale and a confluence of political interests that seek to avoid carbon prices. In this respect, it is important to provide a counterweight, and there are many examples among the jurisdictions that we looked at where targeted transparent communication policies could advance the carbon pricing agenda and provide a counterweight by developing the interest in the renewable energy sector, in the energy efficiency sector, and these have often been as a conducive, found to be a conducive factor for carbon pricing support in the country. Along the legal dimension, many jurisdictions have flagship climate laws, and those are the jurisdictions where the carbon pricing agenda has advanced more than those without. So the presence of a flagship climate law, this is I'm talking about the broad law that covers general mitigation and adaptation strategies, as well as some targets and allocates responsibilities between different levels of government. This is the sort of conducive environment in which carbon pricing instruments can take root and thrive. But the broad law by itself is not enough. Robust regulatory and policy frameworks are necessary, and without them, carbon pricing instruments cannot be developed, and it takes time to develop these. Along the economic dimension, we found that the structure of regulation and state of liberalization in power markets are very important for key decisions along the decarbonization path. This very much interacts with carbon pricing instruments and can reduce the effectiveness of instruments. Power sector assets have very long lives. The services that come out from these assets, the critical infrastructures, are crucial for the well-being of citizens and businesses. They also present natural monopoly conditions. So these are heavily regulated in most countries, not only in the region, but globally. But at the same time, this can be difficult for carbon pricing to have its full textbook effectiveness, so to speak. And the fact that these are heavily regulated sectors means that it is politically very sensitive to reform these sectors. Fossil fuel subsidies are also prevalent in many of the countries in the region, and they are very distortionary and is often put in place for access to providing easy access to energy. These are things that can act to slow down progress on the carbon pricing agenda. On the technical front, we have most jurisdictions having some experience with market-based mechanisms, such as the clean development mechanism, joint implementation, or the joint crediting mechanism of Japan having projects in various countries. And this experience is very useful because it lays the groundwork for carbon pricing instruments in the future, compliance instruments in the future that can help build the infrastructure that is necessary. In fact, in many jurisdictions that we've looked at, the monitoring, reporting, and verification infrastructure has taken root as a part of these market-based mechanisms and can later be upgraded to meet the needs of compliance instruments. Having said that, many jurisdictions in the region lack the detailed technical and administrative capacity necessary to implement and operate carbon pricing to the effectiveness level that we would desire. Here, there is, of course, the help that is coming from countries like Germany and also multilateral organizations, which is a good introduction to my next point regarding the multilateral dimension of carbon pricing readiness and potential. We have found that during the course of the project, actually, the Article 6 negotiations became the Article 6 rule book, and participating in the multilateral frameworks we found in the jurisdictions that we've looked at can help with carbon pricing development in the jurisdictions that are more active in these setup. Here also, the economic cooperation under the ASEAN framework is very relevant for many regions, and this is of course well beyond the narrower climate cooperation in terms of the economic and political cooperation in the region. Multilateral carbon pricing support initiatives such as that of the World Bank, the Partnership for Market Readiness. At the time, it was Partnership for Market Readiness. Now it has evolved into the second phase of this project, Partnership for Market Implementation. The SIACA initiative by the UN through its regional collaboration centers, the International Carbon Action Partnership that facilitates dialogue between emissions trading systems can be very important and are active in the region. They help transfer lessons in the design and implementation phases of the policy, and also transfer knowledge and help build capacity. So, based on this analysis, from which I have talked about some broad messages that apply to many of the jurisdictions in the region, some observations from these jurisdictions in the region, we clustered the jurisdictions into 5 groups. The high impact group, where having emissions reductions would have an effect on the global scale. These are big economies with large exports and imports, and also large emissions. The second group was most exposed to border carbon adjustments. As Professor Klingenfeld mentioned, these are becoming a policy tool in Europe. It's being discussed in various international fora as well, in the form of carbon clubs and climate clubs. So if you have a carbon pricing instrument in place, you certainly get to have an advantage in terms of reducing the burden that may come along with these instruments in the third countries. So those are the most exposed to BCAs. Then there are countries where there are low barriers. This is because of hard work beforehand, because of political will, because of technical conditions being in place. Those are the on the right low barrier cluster that we have identified. Then there are some countries where there are significant political economy obstacles. The political conditions are difficult to overcome. This may be due to the fact that the jurisdictions have a complicated government structure, provincial versus federal levels, responsibilities not assigned. The political wind may be against the carbon pricing potential in the country, where fossil fuel interests may be very strong as well. Then there are the jurisdictions in the group that we call technical barriers, but conducive political conditions. Here, there is the political will, but there are some technical obstacles obstacles, which we thought would be not easy, but easier than the case with the political economy obstacles to address, so that things can move forward in the political in the adoption of a successful carbon pricing instrument. So that was findings from the second work package of the study. The study, you can find it. My colleagues have provided the link. It is an extensive look at, I think, close to 200 pages. Fact sheets of very detailed information. So for all those out there looking at the state of carbon pricing debate in each of these jurisdictions, please use this resource extensively. Our next step was to take a closer look on 3 jurisdictions that we selected in cooperation with DAIST to take a closer look at. And these jurisdictions were Vietnam, Pakistan, and Indonesia. In the previous slides, you had seen the different clusters. One of these jurisdictions is in one of these clusters, which was the motivation for doing this. The reason being that other jurisdictions in the cluster could perhaps find some relevant insights by looking into the findings in the context of Vietnam, Pakistan, and Indonesia. This, of course, doesn't mean that there is one size fits all. A deep analysis in the case of each jurisdiction considering carbon pricing is necessary. How are the fact sheets that were part of the previous report different from what the case studies include? Well, as Maya mentioned, the fact sheets were done based on desk research only. In the case studies, we have gone a step further. We have done a detailed stakeholder mapping exercise based on which we reached out to jurisdiction experts that are in the jurisdiction, stakeholders in the jurisdiction that we need to speak to get a higher resolution picture of where the carbon pricing agenda is in the jurisdiction. So we have reached out to those stakeholders. We conducted several interviews with them, and these informed our case studies. And also, it also provided, we took a closer look at the power sector regulation and its interaction with carbon pricing. As we know, this is a crucial sector in carbon pricing debate. Some quick takeaways from the case studies. I will be necessarily brief here because the analysis in the upcoming report is in-depth and detailed, and every country could take a webinar of its own. So let me just make some broad observations for each of the dimensions that we looked at. Along the political dimension, the influence of and opposition from vested fossil fuel interests were found to be significant in each of the case study jurisdictions, especially in those where there are significant fossil fuel reserves. Along the legal dimension, all 3 countries have flagship climate laws, and this is part of the reason why they are able to make progress despite being in various stages of development in the carbon pricing journey. Their flagship laws enable renewable energy policy frameworks and energy efficiency policy frameworks, which can be useful in developing further the carbon pricing regulations that are required. In the case of Indonesia and Pakistan especially, the fragmented institutional environment was a challenge because the distribution of power between central and subnational governments made it somewhat difficult to work on the carbon pricing development agenda. And coordination across public bodies is often a challenge that was identified in the interviews that we took. Along the economic front, the most important issue that we dealt with was the power sector. The dominance of state-owned enterprises and the long-term power purchase agreements, PPAs, were found to be very difficult barriers to overcome if carbon pricing instruments were to become as effective as they theoretically can be. All jurisdictions in the region have some form of direct or indirect fossil fuel subsidies, and there are ongoing reform processes in their power sector. It was not always encouraging to see that some of the power generation from coal-fired power plants was coming from relatively young assets in the sector. Moreover, many of both the wholesale and retail prices in the region are in the three case study jurisdictions are heavily regulated. On the technical side, the countries are at different stages of progress towards carbon pricing instrument implementation. The main technical challenge, and this is at the heart of both carbon taxes and emissions trading systems, as identified by the interviewees that we spoke to, is the fact that the MRVC system needs to be developed, and the capacity needs to be built on both the public and private sector side for it to be effective. Along the multilateral side, significant motivator for the adoption of carbon pricing instruments in all three case study countries is the use of carbon pricing instruments in their trade partners. For example, in the EU, in South Korea, in Japan, New Zealand, there are carbon pricing instruments already in place, emissions trading systems in most cases, and in several US states and Canada also have systems in place. These are the markets for the three jurisdictions that we've looked at. Moreover, the recent move by EU along the carbon border adjustment mechanism was noted as a major motivator for the development of carbon pricing instruments in the region. A bit over time, I would like to take a few more minutes to tell you the key recommendations from the report. To align carbon pricing instruments with power market regulation and reform is very, very important. There are important benefits from joined up thinking on the process for implementing a carbon pricing instrument and the process for reforming the power sector. This requires a strong legal framework for both the carbon pricing instrument implementation and the power market reform, so that it is stable and enables long-term investment decisions that are necessary. For this, early needs assessment for both power sector reform and carbon pricing implementation is necessary. Also very important is to remove fossil fuel subsidies and to counteract the negative effects of this on the development agenda, provide targeted support instead. So less fossil fuel use without necessarily compromising access to energy, giving access and making sure that that access is affordable, but provided through clean energy sources. Addressing fossil fuel dependencies and interests is critical. For this, engagement with public-private sectors, civil society and international stakeholders as early as possible is important. This early engagement to explain the rationale behind carbon pricing and to raise awareness about how the instrument works, what are the different policy options there are that could help address the challenges that come with the implementation and interaction with, for example, power sectors is important, which of course made me realize that I haven't given you that point on a slide. And my final point relates to multilateral cooperation and dialogue between key jurisdictions that are already implementing a carbon pricing instrument or close to implementation. This helps reflect best practices so that the wheel is not reinvented every time. It allows jurisdictions to avoid common pitfalls and enhance design harmonization, which in turn could reduce leakage concerns and help with linking in the future when this might be a policy option for the jurisdictions concerned. The bilateral and multilateral dialogues in technical working groups to assess needs, to identify solutions to common problems, it will also enable further cooperation among jurisdictions. Finally, an open and early conversation with trade partners to anticipate potential points of resistance and work on cooperative solutions can help the carbon pricing agenda advance in these countries quickly. And finally, drawing support and inspiration from others with relevant experience and access the resources that are provided by technical capacity building efforts that are often funded by those jurisdictions that already implement carbon pricing instruments is very important. Particular priority here is to make the monitoring, reporting, and verification systems as robust as possible. With apologies for going slightly over time, I would like to thank you for your attention and give the word back to Constance.
Thanks very much, Baron. I don't think you need to apologize much for 2 minutes, 2 minutes delay. That's all still entirely fine. We also have some first interesting questions on the chat coming in. We'll leave those that are more discussion questions for the Q&A at the end and answer, let's say, the more clarification questions on the side in the chat, so we can really focus on discussing later on. And this is great pleasure now that I'm opening the floor and perspectives to our 2 other speakers that have ample experience with the type of dialogue and cross-regional exchange that Baran alluded to in his last slide as a necessary driver for carbon pricing to be rolled out more widely. First, over to Dr. Alistair Ritchie. He is the Director of Asia Pacific Sustainability at the Asia Society and Policy Institute. He's currently leading a major project supporting the development of China's national ETS and its regional connections. That project also includes a dialogue facility on ETS development in Asia. So Alistair, you've got a quarter of an hour now to give us your perspective on what is needed to overcome political economy challenges in Asia and how you, any other comments you may have on our project results. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you so much, Constanza. Thank you for welcoming me to this webinar. It's a great opportunity to be part of this event, and well done to the whole team on this very interesting report. It's very interesting to hear your presentation, Baron and Maya. So I really kind of agree with some of the key findings that you've made. Just in terms of my background, the Asia Society Policy Institute is actively working on supporting the development of national emissions trading systems in Asia. As Constanza mentioned, we have a dialogue facility on ETS development in Asia, which we've now had 6 dialogue meetings with different experts. So we work with China, Korea, Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and now India. So we really try to focus on what are the key issues facing the Asian jurisdictions and what are the solutions. So learning from the EU and California, but also learning from each other, because of the power market in particular that Baron has highlighted as a key challenge. So I'd like to present some, I guess, reflections that connect with the presentation we heard earlier, and in particular, I guess, the dimension of the power market ETS interaction. And I'd like to perhaps try to be encouraging in presenting perhaps three elements of this. Firstly, what Asian countries can do now with their existing power market regulatory system, and then secondly, how can they transition to something a bit more conducive to efficient ETS, and then thirdly, what could be the goal, what could be the benefits of a system where the ETS and the power market work very well together. So a lot of my experience has been in Korea. I'm currently based here in Korea. So Korea is an example of a country that has implemented an emissions trading system with a heavily regulated power market. Interestingly, from the comments that mentioned earlier, Korea is not an exporter of fossil fuels, but there's still a strong lobby, again, a strong lobby for coal, a strong lobby for maintaining the high carbon power sector mix and the powerful Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy. But I'd like to perhaps Korea first as perhaps one example. So from 2015 to 2021, it's been operating its ETS with a heavily regulated power market. I guess China is operating its national ETS also with a regulated power market. And I think it's it's important to highlight that it is still very valuable to implement an ETS, even in these conditions. Because the bottom line is that the ETS will achieve the emissions determined by its cap. The efficiency of the power market interaction with the ETS determines, I guess, some optimization issues of the ETS. To what extent can cost-effective reductions happen in the power sector? To what extent can there be fuel switching from coal to low-carbon fuels and renewables, which is critical, but it doesn't, even with some limitations, it doesn't preclude the benefits of an ETS. A Korea has been operating since 2015 successfully, meeting its cap and implementing its ETS successfully. So I would encourage jurisdictions to make a start, think about the scope, think about which sectors would be feasible for the MRV. So if you look at power and energy intensive industry, a very large proportion of national emissions with a relatively small number of installations where the MRV is relatively feasible. There's a lot of experience now on how MRV not only can work in the EU, but how it can work in other jurisdictions like Korea and other countries. The MRV is obviously a crucial element to the ETS, as Baron has mentioned, and it's important to gather verified emissions data for perhaps 2 or 3 years prior to the start of an ETS. So an interesting example of how that was done in Korea, the target management system, which started in 2012, was deliberately intended to be a precursor to the ETS by enabling electronic registry to be developed, by enabling the monitoring, reporting, verification of emissions data and energy data. And that provided the data that was necessary. And it's not only useful for the compliance, but it's also useful for benchmarking, because as people are realizing, benchmarking is a superior method of pre-allocation, and the data from the MRV can be efficiently collected. So the key thing here is then the cap. So each jurisdiction that you're part of will have its NDC, its 2030 national GHG target, which may be revised and so on. And the beauty of the ETS is that it enables the jurisdiction to have security and confidence that the NDC can be met by a policy like an ETS through a cap and trade ETS. So in Korea, 70% of national emissions are covered by ETS. In other jurisdictions, it could be even higher given the energy intensive nature of the economy. So I think that another good thing to learn from Korea is how there's a link between the NDC target and the cap. It's a very simple link in Korea. It's basically the ETS cap is basically the national emissions target multiplied by the ratio of ETS emissions divided by total national emissions in a historic reference year. So it's very simple. The EU is another good method of how you can go from an overall target to an ETS cap and how that burden sharing could be done. And if you come into the overall purpose of the ETS, it's about emissions reductions. So even in a constrained power market, there is still opportunity to improve emissions in the power sector by moving to more efficient generating mix within the fuel band. But what happens in Korea is that the power sector becomes a buyer of allowances. So whilst the power sector perhaps has got its hands tied behind its back, it can't do what at the moment before the environmental merit audit, which I'll come to, it hasn't been able to easily switch fuels. It drives up the carbon price, which makes reductions in the industry sector more attractive. Because the ETS is not just one sector, it's power and industry plus other sectors. It creates the motivation for other sectors to reduce their emissions and sell to the power sector. So there's assurance that the overall target's met. The power sector provides a lot of demand. It can drive up the price and it can support the reductions. And one of the critical benefits is also on the industry side. So industry can see that there is a long-term investment signal on the pathway to net zero. So what we've seen in Korea, for example, a lot of companies have now got their net zero transition plans. There's a lot of activity towards hydrogen steelmaking and to various long-term strategies, because they can see that the ETS cap is linked to the NDC target. So one thing that needs to happen is that the in this period before the power market is liberalized, then indirect emissions allocation, as you're probably familiar with, need to be used as a method to try and reduce the demand for electricity by giving allowances for electricity consumption and heat, which is similar to the Chinese pilots and the Korean system. But moving on to the next step is the transition. So the key thing here is the transition to a system where the carbon price can be a driver, and where the ETS can drive the reductions in GHG, not only through the carbon price signal, but also through climate finance. And the real key to unlocking this is the ability to pass through the carbon costs to electricity prices, and also reflect these carbon costs in the power station dispatch decision. So in the case of Korea, the environmental merit order has been implemented as of this year. So this is a methodology to take the existing economic merit order, where power stations are dispatched in order of their variable operating costs. Historically, this didn't include carbon. Now it does. So they now have a mechanism to try and move away from coal, move towards lower carbon fuels. And also they have enabled so that's working at the wholesale level, but then at the retail level, there's a mechanism to pass through that to retail prices, although there's still a cap and a limitation on the extent to which that can happen. So we're working on an issue brief at the moment on this, and we'll publish that in a month or so. But we've actually just published an issue brief on China's ETS and power market interaction. So in China, their power market is very different, and we've looked at how the power market reform process can align to ETS implementation, and have looked at how these two could be aligned, and how. But very interesting in China, with the problems of the energy supply, it's speeded up power market reform. And actually in China, there's a big increase in the use of the power market compared to the old agreements that they had. So there's a big opportunity now in China to make these connections. So there are definitely very strong, as we heard earlier, there are strong political barriers to something like the environmental merit order. Technically, is quite simple. It's basically just adding carbon costs to a list of other variable operating costs, many fuel costs. But politically, it's difficult. And in Korea, it's very difficult politically to implement this, and it took a long time. But what they realized is that the ETS just wasn't causing any reductions in the power sector. And they realized that they can't carry on by not dealing with coal-fired power generation, and they need to have something that can drive the shift away from coal. So there was a political mood change, I believe, and that's also connected to public opinion and air quality issues and so on. So I think that that's the political issues change in time, so they're not stuck forever with a strong lobby of the energy ministry, etc. So I think there's a positive message there. And then, so what that does, once the mechanisms can be put in place, then it really just opens the door to achieve the success that you can see in the EU in terms of being able to introduce and scale up auctioning. So once the auctioning can be scaled up, which can happen once the carbon costs can be passed through to electricity prices, then it strengthens the carbon price signal. And the strong carbon price signal combined with tighter caps that would be necessary through the alignment of the cap to 2030 NDC will have a significant impact on the abatement opportunity of the ETS. And also the amount of auction scale-up generates huge amounts of revenue. So in the EU, it's about 120 billion dollars of revenue that's been generated. So, and then I think, as we heard earlier, the revenue can be used to support not only deep decarbonisation in industry and clean energy transition, but also protect vulnerable stakeholder groups, both households as well as industries. And so really I think there's a key there that could just open the door to very effective mitigation potential. And I guess we can see the success story in the EU. We can see that there's progress being made in Asia. There's jurisdictions that maybe have a similar economic merit order to Korea might be able to learn quite a lot from their experience, because there might be a lot of parallels. Jurisdictions similar to China can also learn a lot from them. But yeah, so I think that there are opportunities. It's not a showstopper. I think there's ways in which ETS can work, yeah, there definitely needs to be a clean energy transition. And I think just relying on renewable portfolio standards for renewable transition is not enough. There needs to be something to make coal less attractive. There needs to be, and the role of the carbon price is the one thing that can do that. So we really believe that this is an exciting time. And also, as we heard recently, India is really pushing ahead now with very ambitious long-term ETS plans as well. So, but yeah, we're very happy to cooperate. I can perhaps share the link to the paper that we just published on the China power market ETS interaction. So we're very interested to cooperate with all of you, and would be interested to keep in touch. Thank you very much for allowing me to make some comments.
Many thanks, Alistair. Really interesting, also particularly the insights from Korea and the deep dive on power sector, which I think is a really critical piece here, how to use carbon pricing to move away from coal. Now passing over to Benny Suyadi, an equally eminent and very much legitimated expert and speaker on this topic. Benny currently manages a pioneering regional project in Southeast Asia on the intersection between energy and climate. It's called ASEAN Accept, and it supports 10 governments to think about low carbon development in the power sector. Benny, very pleased you're here, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Konstantin. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I also greatly appreciate Dr. Baran, Doda, and Maya for sharing the work and finding from the 3 years long projects on the carbon pricing potential and readiness in the East and the South Asia. And as introduced, my name is Benny Suredi, and from the ASEAN Center for Energy, an intergovernmental organization that represent the interests of the 10 countries in the Southeast Asia region on the energy cooperation, and playing the roles as an energy think tank, catalyst, and knowledge hub. We support the 10 ASEAN member states through the strong collaboration and partnership with the Ministry of Energy, guided by regional blueprint on the energy cooperation, what we call it the ASEAN Plan of Action for the Energy Cooperation. It was set under the theme Enhancing Energy Connectivity and Market Integration in ASEAN to achieve the energy security, accessibility, affordability, and sustainability for all. Last month, the ASEAN Center for Energy released its flagship study, the 7 ASEAN Energy Outlook, which was presented to the 40th ASEAN Minister on Energy meeting in Cambodia. This Outlook 7 report the latest status of the ASEAN energy landscape and projects multiple realistic features to gather insight in exploring a more challenging time ahead. And no surprise on the finding, of course, as a region expected to continue to rely on the fossil fuels in order to fuel the growth energy demand almost triple by 2040s. And without the new policy that ASEAN's GHG emission is also projected to increase 3.5-fold compared to the 2020 figures. with the expected population growth as well, will correspond then to the annual average rates of the 8.5 ton of CO2 equivalent per capita for ASEAN as a whole, which broadly compared to the current per capita rates of the GHG emission in Europe today. But the interesting thing is also from this outlook that we identified the future policy on the carbon pricing would advance the energy transition in this region. In many ways, it could, for example, the introduction of the carbon pricing could make the electric solution even more attractive. Supporting policy and financial incentive such as carbon pricing can also be very critical, as already highlighted in the finding from Dr. Warren, that reducing fossil fuels reliant in low to medium temperature heat industry, and policy intervention such as carbon pricing could further lower the cost of various renewable energy projects, maturing technology with more commercial large-scale projects, and many more on that. As we all know, the projected results are interpreted as economically optimum pathway for ASEAN, where all countries and region cooperatively reduce the emission with appropriate harmonization of the climate policy, such as carbon pricing. And I think this is, coming from the fact sheet, but something that also can tell that the ASEAN region has considerably potential for the carbon pricing. Singapore may be a starting point where we can talk. It took 4 years for them to develop the carbon pricing policy. Singapore implement a short-term certainty of price. They engage companies on the one-on-one basis to explain, for example, the revenue cycling mechanism. Then Singapore is also applied different type of the price mechanism, including what is famous or unfamously internal shadow carbon pricing. Brunei Darussalam, which is also part of the studies that's included here, is also considering carbon pricing, and our team at the ASEAN Center for Energy is working closely with them. As a major fossil fuel exporter, modeling the policy instrument of the carbon pricing is essential to prepare the exports in new area and fill the upcoming hole in the export revenue. And it is also very much in line with the key finding that Dr. Baran and Maya presented earlier. Subsidies in the petroleum price are opposites to lower fossil consumption and carbon track, and lowering the subsidies in the petroleum could generate higher carbon pricing revenue and enhance the energy transition. Indonesia, of course, also another countries that the focus was on with presidential decree number 98 in 2021. The carbon price is expected to drive more financing and green investment that has an impact on reducing GHG emission. Indonesia is supposed to be implemented on the 1st April this year, but it's a bit being delayed. But a successful implementation of the carbon pricing needs to be supported by a decisive, accountable, and transparent policy. Government at the national levels will also collaborate with the private sectors, local government, and other parties to achieve more ambitious climate targets. And in addition, the private sector is also very crucial, since the private sector can participate in technology innovation or in efficient business process. But in ASEAN level, that we echo the message from the studies that coordination, or maybe so in the context of coordination across aligned ministries, including the finance ministry, and alignment of the carbon pricing in the national plan or in NDC, as the Dr. Alistair Ritchie mentioned, it as a cost-effective approach that we are considering. And in fact, maybe some of you also know that there also have been a call for the introduction of the ASEAN-wide carbon tax in this region. But back to the study that just presented, once again, I'd like to applaud the approach, the finding. started with developing a theoretical framework, identifying the key driver and obstacle along the political, legal, economic, technical, and regional dimension, then identifying the indicator and variables along each dimension to understand the relevant condition, and then applying it, be it in the broader level or adjust it to each particular situation in the countries. I'm very excited to learn that 6 countries are included. If I correctly counted it, 6 countries from the ASEAN is included, which represent around 80% of the energy mix in this region. But it's also very interesting to learn how this country is being clustered, like both Indonesia and Philippines are in the bucket of low barrier, but while Indonesia is also clustered as a high impact, Philippines is not, but it's still recognized as having a technical barrier, but a conducive political condition. So the clustering is really help the countries to understand where is the position and then what are the things, the action that they need to embark. The last point I would like to comment is on the key recommendation on the multilateral cooperation or dialogue with the jurisdiction already with CPI or closer to the implementation. I totally agree with this and fully recognize the tremendous effort that has been made by many institutions. Of course, the World Bank Partnership for the Market Readiness is one of it, or by ICAP itself, the International Carbon Action Partnership is crucial to bring the important transfer lesson in design and implementation phase of the instrument, especially important in a war with the border carbon adjustment mechanism, facilitators transfer knowledge and help with the capacity. We at the ASEAN Center for Energy are still in the early stage of this effort. There are several ongoing initiatives at this moment, including our joint study with several countries. But as I mentioned earlier, our main focus or official work is guided by the APAC, and then it's aimed to enhance the energy connectivity and market integration to achieve the energy security, accessibility, affordability, and sustainability for all, where carbon pricing is not directly translated. So we need to have a proper way to embed the consent on this topic. But the good news is the new phase of our projects, the ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project is expected to be commencing very soon. So continuing to the success of the phase 1 of the projects, the ASEAN Center for Energy in a strong partnership with Dr. Indra Verland and his team at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and supported by the government of Norway, we aim to move the ASEAN energy transition to a low carbon energy system and thereby contribute towards global carbon neutrality in the coming years. And carbon pricing is one of our key focus. Hence, we look forward to collaboration and cooperation from everyone in this critical mission, and also look forward for the releasing of the final report. I stop here, happy to have a follow-up discussion. Thank you, back to you, Konstantin.
Thanks very much, Benny. Equally very interesting. I think it's really important that ASEAN is on board with these efforts, given your long-standing experience in regional collaboration in the region. And yes, not just, what did you say, a number, I don't remember, 6 out of our 15 cases are from ASEAN, but actually also 2 out of our 3 deep dives. So there's really quite some fodder on this region.
Once again, I fully share Barandoda's point that CBAM, if well implemented and also well appreciated and received, can be and should be a cooperation instrument towards better climate protection around the world. This is clearly the way I personally see it, and we should all in our different capacities work towards that perspective. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's almost already a good closing remarks, to which I have little to add. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the participants for this rich discussion. You have seen the links to our reports. Keep on the lookout for the final report, which should be forthcoming shortly. Follow us on Twitter, Carbon Pricing @Adelphi. And yeah, looking forward to continuing this discussion and seeing many more instruments popping up and becoming more effective over time. Thanks to everyone.